My name is Bailey Herman, and this is my final presentation for Introduction to Art. The artist I chose that interested me the most was Chuck Close. Charles Thomas, or Chuck, Close was born on July 5, 1940 in Monroe, Washington. He is still alive today. Throughout his time in school, Chuck struggled with his schoolwork because of his severe dyslexia. He also suffered from a neuromuscular condition that did not allow him to participate in sports, making him relatively unpopular. However, even though most of his schoolwork was difficult for him, Chuck excelled in art. His parents showed great support for his creativity early on in his life. Unfortunately, when Chuck was 11, his father died, and his mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. Also around this time, Chuck developed a kidney infection, which kept him in bed for nearly a year. Throughout all of this, Chuck continued his love for painting and other art. When he was 14, he went to a Jackson Pollock exhibition. Later, he would realize Pollock's style made him determined to become an artist. And the painting on the right is one of Jackson Pollock's. Chuck enrolled at the University of Washington and graduated in 1962 from the School of Art there. After he graduated, he immediately went east to study at Yale. Here he received a Master's of Fine Arts from their Art and Architecture School. The Fulbright grant allowed him to study at an art school in Vienna after his graduation from Yale. After this, Chuck began to teach at the University of Massachusetts, where he worked with abstract expressionist styles. In 1967, he married one of his students, Leslie Rose. They then moved to New York City, where Chuck began to teach drawing, painting, and design at the School of Visual Arts. While teaching here, Chuck dramatically changed his artistic style. Discovering his signature, photorealism, he created large Polaroids of models and then recreated them on giant canvases. His earliest work was extremely bold and intimate, in which he replicated tiny details of the faces he selected. The fact that he could recreate these faces was very interesting, because in his later life he suffered from a neurological condition, face blindness, that prevented him from being able to recognize faces. Chuck did most of his artwork on large-scale portraits that were monochrome. The subject of his portraits were himself, his friends, and his family. Most of the friends he painted were artists as well. He wanted the subjects of his paintings to be relatively unknown to the public. That way the person in the painting would not distract from the actual artwork itself. This is also why most of his artworks are only titled with the subject's first name. Chuck's work was so detailed that there was almost no distinction between the photograph and the painting. He was also very skilled with the application of color, which helped the future creation of the inkjet printer. In the late 1960s, Chuck was most famous in the New York City area. His most popular subject, Philip Glass, was painted and displayed in 1969. Chuck also would go on to paint Bill Clinton and other prominent and well-known figures. By the time the 1970s rolled around, Chuck's paintings were extremely well-known and were being displayed in some of the finest galleries in the world. At this time, he was already considered one of the United States' best artists. Though not his first ever painting, this artwork depicts the general idea of what most of Chuck's early work consisted of. This painting, titled Big Self-Portrait, is 9 feet tall and is about 50 times the size of an actual human head. To create this, Chuck used only about half a teaspoon of black paint, which he watered down and applied to the canvas with an airbrush and other brushes. He also scraped it with razor blades to gain sharper definition, and rubbed other areas with an eraser to blend. Chuck wanted this painting to be so large so that the viewer could see it from all different angles and not see the whole head at once. In 1968, Chuck created another painting titled Nancy. To create this painting and all of his other works, Chuck used a grid. Driven by his struggle with dyslexia and his inability to remember and recognize faces, he chose to make portraits in order to help remember those faces. In order to paint these large-scale drawings of faces he barely recognized, he developed a grid. Using this grid, he can focus on individual areas and tiny units of the painting to work on. Chuck puts a grid over top of the photographs he works from and works it inch by inch along the canvas. Chuck created this work titled Kent in 1970. He used drawings for the first time to explore the three-color process. In order to create this artwork, Chuck painted the same image on top of itself 3 separate times in different colors. Even though this painting is still very detailed, it is not as precise as his other paintings. Throughout his career, Chuck experimented with many different techniques. In 1979, he created this work titled Phil, in which he used his own fingerprints over and over again to create the image of Philip. This would become one of Chuck's most popular artworks of all time. From a distance, the fingerprints are relatively unrecognizable. However, up close, each individual fingerprint is distinct. This painting, titled Fanny, was created by Chuck in 1985. He enjoyed the interaction between art and material and chose to work in finger painting while creating this artwork. This painting is a portrait of Chuck's grandmother and is one of my favorite paintings. Besides his first self-portrait, this is Chuck's most detailed and precise painting, even though he used finger painting. In the earlier years of his life, Chuck struggled with health issues. This continued on throughout his life, and in 1988 he suddenly ruptured a spinal artery. He was attending a dinner at Gracie Mansion, the mayor's residence. He suddenly began to experience chest, back, and arm pain. A policeman that was at the event helped him across the street to the emergency room. Immediately after this, Chuck was almost entirely paralyzed. He was then transferred to New York University Medical Center. Here he spent 2 months in both intensive and critical care. However, after more than 6 months of therapy, he began to gain back some use of his limbs, though he was still permanently in a wheelchair. Even though most people would give up after this sort of incident, Chuck continued to persevere. He began to paint with a brush taped to his wrist, which somewhat altered his style and made it less precise. He also wore a splint on his arm and used a mechanical easel that would raise, lower, and rotate his canvas to wherever was most comfortable for him. However, despite the setbacks caused by his injury, his reputation never changed. Chuck continues to be one of America's greatest artists, and in 2000, President Clinton chose Chuck to receive the National Medal of Arts. In 2007, his life was made into a documentary titled Chuck Close: A Portrait in Progress. Chuck created his first painting after his paralysis in 1989, titled Alex 2. He created this painting from a Polaroid taken of his friend Alex Katz. This painting not only depicts a friend, but also Chuck's courage to continue his art even after his health issues. In 1997, Chuck created another self-portrait which contrasted greatly with his first from 1967. Instead of being as precise, this self-portrait was more abstract due to his sudden paralysis at the time and the use of new painting methods. This self-portrait also included color, which the one in 1967 did not. In 2004, Chuck created another painting titled James, in which he applied a diagonal grid along the painting to incorporate color and increase the abstract elements. The use of the diagonal grid showed uniqueness compared to his previous paintings, in which he used a horizontal grid with much less color. I chose to do this presentation on Chuck Close because his artwork interested me the most. I had never seen someone be able to paint so well and with such detail that it actually looked like a photograph. I also chose Chuck because he is still alive today and continues to make artwork even after his injuries. Thank you for watching.